we start the video essay, I'd like y'all to hold your horses and just wait a little bit, because before we begin, I will list some trigger warnings. First of all, trigger warning for discussion or mention of self-harm, hate speech, and sexual abuse in passing. No in-depth of any of those, really, except for maybe hate speech. This is a very heavy video essay, and I would not recommend it if you're looking for some lighthearted fun, some exaggerated entertainment. Sure, feel free to play it as like background music when you draw, because I know some of you guys are going to be drawing while you're watching this. But I am not going to shy away from covering heavier topics in this video essay, so just a heads up while we... So, hello again. Either you've stumbled across this video, a completely unknowing curious stranger, wondering what the hell the Kinstagram that's mentioned in the title is, or perhaps you know very little about it, although you've heard it in your wanderings across the web. Or, and I wonder if this is more likely, you're acutely, painfully aware of what Kinstagram is. Hell, you're probably on it yourself. Who knows? I don't know. So sit down and cozy up, because this is going to be a long one while I ramble about Kinstagram and my own and others' personal experiences. I use we when referring to Kinstagram sometimes throughout the video, for the sake that my own experience is also a part of it and contributes to this essay as well. Now, this essay is roughly set up into sections, but I didn't and won't bother labeling them because I do crisscross through very different territories pretty frequently. And yet another and final important warning: I will not directly mention any popular accounts, people, nor drama in this video. So if you are involved with any drama in Kinstagram, I will not be mentioning any of it. Because A, there was too much of it to ever fully cover, and B, I'm honestly a bit too lazy to research these things thoroughly. This video will not be strictly analytical or statistical, but it will not be gossip either. I also want to say that I may generalize occasionally throughout this essay, as it's hard not to with a semi-hive-minded community like Kinsta. I do not mean to ostracize nor demonize any experiences. I am solely speaking off of the experience of survey respondents, my friends, and myself. Let me start out with the basics. Kinstagram, or Kinsta for short, and that's how most people refer it to, is a niche community within Instagram devoted to kinning characters that was most active from 2019 to 2021. Although it still exists, and it existed way before that. Those 3 years, however, were its peak, at least from what I'm aware. There really isn't that much info on Kinsta out there, so a lot of what I'm going to be saying is, again, from survey respondents, or just estimated guesses from my time on there, from my time observing out from outside. Now, if you don't know what kinning is, it's essentially deeply identifying with a fictional character. Kinda like if pointing at your favorite character and saying, "literally me," was a word. This video essay will be drawing from my own personal experience of Kinstagram from 2019 to 2022, which was when I was on it. However, due to that period of 3-ish years being incredibly turbulent for me, I've forgotten most of my memory from that time. Fortunately, I received almost 40 responses, 39 to be exact, to my survey for this project back in December 2023, which I'm very blessed for. It will help me craft this video essay. My deepest thanks to everyone who responded. Now, again, there is a lot of lingo and almost a subculture to Kinstagram. It goes deep. What I mentioned before doesn't even cover the bare surface. This terminology, as I'm going to call it, goes, pretty deep. There is a small but deeply ingrained culture to the community, a sort of estranged terminal onlineness that is hard to find anywhere else on the internet. It is very reflective of the people within Kinstagram and the people who are part of it. Take, for example, the term IRL. While, yes, the innocent passerby, this is just another abbreviation, something you might say casually in text, like saying, "oh, let's discuss this IRL instead of on text." It had a much deeper and a much more serious meaning in the Kinstagram community. IRL became a noun, an identity. If you don't understand what I mean, well, being an IRL meant that you were that character you kinned. It was a step above kinning, in fact, transcending fun and games and becoming a full-fledged persona. No buts, no ifs, no questions, and often no self-awareness of self. You were the character in the flesh. Often IRLs were convinced they were the embodiment of a character physically and mentally. Sound familiar? Well, I bet you wouldn't be surprised to hear that one of the synonyms for IRL was D/A, or short for delusional attachment. IRLs and DAs typically most often came from like anime and Japanese video games, ones such as Danganronpa, N-Stars, Bungo Stray Dogs, but they weren't limited to such media. They could even stem from real-life people, although that was pretty rare. Now, disclaimer, IRLs are not to be confused with OSDD and DAD fictives. Those are completely different things. I am not an expert on DAD, so I will not even be touching that. Now, the most important part of being an IRL was perceiving yourself as the character and believing others should perceive you like that as well. If you haven't picked up on this little bit yet, Kinsta was and still is a place both devoid of self-awareness and painfully full of it. The people that reside within it are, or at least were in the past, constructed of a very hypocritical ignorance. Kinsta was built on this primal need to not heal, but to hide. Now, I'll touch more on that later. Returning back to Kinsta lingo, there are a few other words that were incredibly commonplace. DNI and BYF, which respectfully are acronyms that mean do not interact and before you follow, were kind of like warnings placed on customizable websites called cards, which you've probably heard of, that most Kinstagrammers, another word, would link in their bios. They're still pretty frequent in fandom spaces, both cards and BYF and DNIs, but Kinsta took it to a whole other level. Most frequently and intensely, you'd see a lot of people put doubled DNI in their cards. Doubles are like their own whole complete other can of worms, but doubles DNI, to sum up, essentially meant if you, the person interacting, were also an IRL of the same person who wrote the card, the person who wrote the card didn't want you to interact. It all boiled down to not wanting someone who's also literally you on your account, because there was only one you being that fictional character. It sounds crazy saying all of this in retrospect, but to be fair, we were pretty crazy back then. You'd also see a lot of things like, insert fandom I dislike DNI, or insert belief I disagree with DNI, as backed up by my many survey answers that responded saying they had those things on the DNI fandom and beliefs, whatever. Other words worth mentioning are gore spamming, which meant to, well, spam a targeted person with gore, big yikes, and romcc, which was like a comfort romantic character, kind of like self-shipping, which is shipping a character with yourself. A popular post to make were tag posts. Posts where you tag your friends as characters or dynamics that you both related to. These were really fun and sweet, and also, of course, they could cause drama too, although they typically didn't. They were just like little like friendship bracelets almost. Online friendship bracelets. Confession accounts / kinny-fessing accounts were there too. Those were kind of like places where people would submit, usually anonymously, confessions surrounding kinning or a piece of media, and then you'd watch the crowds go crazy in the comments over the certain confession. Confessing accounts had some of the biggest reach and also sparked some of the biggest drama. It was a wild time. Now, with what I hope you understand as a vague concept of Kinstagram, let's proceed to the big stuff. When I opened the survey for this very video essay, I was surprised to see more people had positive experiences than negative. 38.5% positive compared to a negative 28.2% to be exact. I hadn't imagined this end result, if I'm going to be really completely honest. My experiences on Kinstagram were very negative and the effects very long lasting. But the masses seem to have agreed that the community and friends found through Instagram far outweigh the frequent doxing, gore spamming, canceling, and the gazillion call-out posts. Oh my god, the call-out posts. Anyhow, Kinstagram still provided something many other places didn't offer, a refuge. In the words of one anonymous submitter, Friends were easy to find and make, especially because of how centered around interests it is, being Kinsta. There's a lot of popular interests everyone shares, and I guess it helps you get in touch with yourself because of all the focus on identity with kinning, personality types and stuff. And it's easy to find community among queer and neurodivergent plus mentally ill people. Honestly, I couldn't have put it better myself. There is something incredibly special about being surrounded by people like you. To find like-minded individuals is very hard in real life, and the cookie-cutter process of finding friends on Kinstagram made it even more specific and harder to maintain, but easier to keep. You wouldn't let just anyone into your private Kinstagram account either, or priv for short. Often, Kinstagrammers would only accept your follow request if you read their card thoroughly and found the pass or password. This tended to be a word or a prompt they asked for you to DM to them, so they knew you had read through their card and were willing to endure their ranting and craziness. Or at least it was in my case. Due to the structure of the friendship process, Kinsta friendships can last a long time and endure a ridiculous amount of problems. Remember when I said follow requests like 2 seconds ago? Scratch that. They were much more like dedicated friend requests, because once you were in, you were in. Becoming mutuals was a dedication and often taken as a sign of friendship, or at least acquaintanceship. Most of the mutuals you made on Kinsta were and are trans, gay, or some other flavor of queer. Most have ADHD, autism, or some other form of neurodivergent disorder. At the time, almost everyone on Kinsta was mentally ill. Hell, it was almost like a requirement. You probably wouldn't be able to withstand the environment if you weren't. Kinstagram was a space made and catering to the mentally ill and neurodivergent individual. One of the few internet communities that I'd argue still remains to be so. Thus, a lot of the content on Kinsta caters to those mentally ill and/or neurodivergent people. Kinsta wasn't and still isn't for the neurotypical socially acceptable people that you see randomly on the street. This is a place for weirdos of all flavors, and even though it is not the most welcoming, people find themselves comforted by the idea of like-minded peers that they could not find in real life. Taking the words from a survey response from H_K_ and the number 12, multiple underscores, I'm not reading out loud all that. Most of the people that I've seen online or known in real life who are in kinning spaces are seeking a form of escape from their home or school lives, or are just seeking a community of people who share their mental health issues. And having a positive space to talk about those issues, especially if therapy is not an option, is a good thing in my opinion. Pretty spot on, pretty good thoughts. The last piece to this positivity puzzle, and perhaps the most important piece, is that everyone was young, either a young adult or a young teen, although most likely a young teen. Over 40% of the people who answered my survey still are. Our brains were still ripe for development, and perhaps hardened from the mental toil most of us have went through in the past. We allowed the hands of others on Kinstagram to mold our minds. It is a common joke within ex-Kinstagrammers to say that the time on Kinstagram was fundamental to our brain's developments. But I honestly genuinely believe it to be true. I will never forget 13-year-old me creating my first card, or my second or third, writing down my kin list while making clear which ones I didn't want doubles for. It may sound incredibly silly and very stupid, but it was important to me back then. It still is, in a sense. For those moments led to hours of interaction, patterns, and personality traits I still carry to this day, including interests. Kinsta clings to me like old clothes I can never throw away, a fond memory despite its stains and rips. I think it does feel like that for a lot of ex-Kinstagrammers. This addictive quality of Kinstagram made most remain, or still be, on Kinstagram for a very long time. 41% of my survey takers have been on Kinstagram, or had been on Kinstagram, for over 3 years. None of them had been on it for under 3 months. Kinstagram is not easily shed or let go of. It is something that stays with you forever. As I briefly mentioned beforehand, Kinstagram was and mildly still is comparable to a subculture. People on Kinstagram tended to share basic values and political beliefs, albeit the details within this belief sometimes differed and would often cause falling outs. These beliefs were still very much left-leaning, no matter the person, with a zero-tolerance policy typically for homophobia, transphobia, racism, or just general prejudice. Participating in any of these aforementioned things was a near 100% way of getting cancelled and mass reported. Now, besides all that, Kinstagram had a deeply integrated community. It was deeply interconnected, deeply intimate space where sharing vulnerability was commonplace and passion even more so, a rare zebra in the horizon of social monotony. People were open, willing to discuss their emotions. It didn't always end in the best results, but it happened. You could open your heart up to near strangers and they'd respond with the same level of heartfeltness. You could rant for hours on end reciprocally without any judgment, and that, I think, is why so many enjoyed their stay on Instagram more than they hated it. Understanding of the misunderstood will always overrule malice coming from an outer force. Again, rises this Kinstagram dilemma of hypocrisy. In a space so ridden with harassment, people felt the most comfortable. Yes, doxing, openly hating, and mass reporting and blocking people for the fig list of issues was absurdly common, but so was being genuine and yourself. Kinsta was a place for self-expression, and at its very core, self-experimentation. You could use a million gazillion micro-labels or use none at all, and still no one would bat an eye. I truly do not think I would be the same person I am today if it wasn't for the leniency of identity I was permitted within Kinstagram. With the insane amount of questioning I went through there, I would not have come to the self-realization for who I am today. Now, Kinstagram was a place of big, thick borders, strictly drawn lines between different private accounts, ready to attack if an enemy got within their space. Now, but it was not only these metaphysical borders that existed, mental ones did too. During my time on Kinstagram, almost everything about you had to fit into a tight box, a capsule identity, gone within a bite. I am absolutely not against genders or neopronouns. I still use these/her pronouns myself, but the amount of people who tended to have them during Kinstagram was insane. I was no exception, as I had a whole page dedicated to my genders and pronouns. There was even a fun word for accumulating different identities and pronouns: gender hoarding. I liked it. It made me feel like a dragon protecting its golden chest of identity. Anyhow, it was hard to think outside of these boxes. You were meant to be unconventionally, Kinstagram-fully conventional. In fact, you'd even see some people bullying weirdos who weren't on Kinstagram. This kind of herd mentality was strong within Kinsta. Here's something an Anion survey taker said that I think sums it up pretty well. Moral of the story, everyone on Kinsta is just a bunch of sheep and the shepherd is just some random popular Kinstagrammer. I guess it does stem from attachment issues and severe fear of missing out, but oh well. Yet again, I'd like to mention Kinstagram's strange paradoxical values. From one side, we see teens who never fit in fleeing to Kinstagram, finding their place within their kin lists and their cards. From the opposite side, we see the strange want, almost need to fit into this community, making sure you continue to secure your place. An easy example would be the sheer amount of hate trains that people would board and follow around. Herd mentality, classic case of it. Once a popular account would get exposed, everyone in the entire community knew about it. Everyone would hate them, and harassment and death threats would ensue. Almost everyone I personally know who was, or I'm still in touch with, Kinsta, have had insults and harassment verbally launched at them, and it could be about anything, from the way you look, to the ships you ship, and most commonly, the characters you kinned. The harassment truly knew no bounds, and sometimes it even felt like people were projecting, throwing their own self-hatred towards you in form of call-out posts. I've begun to realize that on Kinstagram, no one really wholeheartedly loved themselves, and no one wanted to learn how to. Perhaps that is why we were so attached to these fictional characters, these characters who actually got character development and had a finality and story arc, usually good one. Characters that weren't constantly pitted against real life. Every reputation on Kinstagram was a fragile one. you could be torn to pieces within seconds, especially from the time period of 2020 to 2022. There was no room for errors or mistakes or any slipping up or weird phrasing of any kind. If someone disagreed with you, they'd make it clear. Now, I hate to say this, but many of us who were canceled and were the ones canceling the others out were really just too young to put minor differences aside and just get along, hold hands, and sing Danganronpa fan songs. Alongside harmful discouragement and frequent canceling of random as hell individuals, toxic encouragement was in the very veins of Kinstagram. Instead of helping ground people in reality, we would encourage them in their delusions, watching people progressively get more caught up in a false identity till they broke. There was even a word for reminding people they were going through psychosis, delusion, or paranoia, or anything similar. Reality checking. Reality checking was looked down upon, often frowned at, even in professional sittings with a therapist. I remember reading a card about how it was wrong, and then 2 years later I check, and the creator has created a professional essay with resources and citations mentioning how it's a bad thing. Times change quick. Reality checking, of course, is not the end of it. Toxicity and encouragement came hand in hand after all. Poison and peonies, an allegedly fair trade. This anti-recovery mindset was everywhere. You'd get told it was okay to do these harmful things, to think these terrible thoughts. But it wasn't in an innocent kind of comforting coming from an ignorant perspective, or one that's trying to help you get up. After all, most of us knew what the other person was feeling because we had felt it as well. No, it was like willingly staying in the fire of hell together, hand in hand, refusing to walk out. In this hellish sense, finding like-minded peers was a double-sided coin. Friends and mutuals tended to be incredibly similar to you in both good and bad ways. 51% of the people who took my survey said that they had at some point been at risk due to Instagram, from death threats to doxing. Perhaps the risks did not outweigh the positive factors, but it for sure did leave a mark on morale. Look at this response to one of my questions from the user Yennefer of Adern. I hope I pronounced that correct. Me and friends started exposing multiple people for their actions. They deny to their audiences, and then bite their own foot when screenshots came from their Kinstas and would be exposed. Many death threats, many rape threats, many bigoted comments. I was physically, sexually assaulted, and they told me it was because they were kin shifting and had memories that made them want to do that. Jesus Christ! I am so sorry for your experience. But hopefully this response has exposed just how extreme Kinstagrammers were when it came to the most trivial, banal subjects, and how trivial and banal they were to the most extreme subjects. Oh, also another word I forgot to mention. Kin-shifting means you were kind of transported into your kin's mind. It was weird. Really, really weird, and in most cases probably either a lie or a psychotic episode. I really wonder now whether there truly is a connection with being on Kinstagram and brain development. I don't have any hopes whatsoever for a study to be published in relation to it, but it's still a fascinating subject. Most ex-Kinstagrammers I know still talk about Kinstagram sometimes, or even often, reminiscing memories of good and bad old times. To quote an Instagram story I once reposted that I think summarizes this situation perfectly: when you're low-key building your life, but Instagram is forever. Yeah, that hits the spot. And not to dig too deep into a funny joke, but there's genuinely something strange that hovers over you once you begin to pick your life up from the places it was shattered from during your time on Instagram. It's like a ghost of your past self holding itself back, whispering into your ear not words of support, but words of nostalgia. Look at me now, I think to myself sometimes. 2020 me would never believe it. They are a past I still carry with me, one I doubt I will ever learn to shed. I'm low-key building my life, but the remainders of Kinstagram will linger forever. Kinstagram, after all, was a method of positive escapism, but it was also a tool for mild to not so mild mental self-harm. People on Kinsta found it difficult to leave and still do, as an emotional attachment, whether good or bad, has been formed to Kinstagram. Many often enter Kinsta aware of the negative consequences, which they just completely disregard. Again, the sense of refuge is too comforting to be overpowered by the negative feelings. I guess escapisms and self-harm do coincide quite frequently, but not at the severity at which the two collided on Kinsta. I am going to Christian this strange situation by the name the Kinstagram oxymoron. Obviously, this isn't like a psychologically valid phenomenon or anything, but I still think it's pretty interesting, and it's interesting enough to be mentioned and named. The whole of Kinstagram is an oxymoron, to be honest. Many of my observations and takes seem hypocritical when put side to side, but that doesn't invalidate them. Kinstagram was hypocritical. For a community that thought within incredibly black and white boxes, there were a lot, and I mean a lot, of muddled gray areas. I suppose I should return to a topic I mentioned briefly in the beginning of this video essay more directly: how we as teenagers and youth, through health and or other crises, flock to each other. How we hid instead of healed. I genuinely can't describe Kinstagram metaphorically better than the chronically online war trenches. Yes, Kinstagram stunk. Yes, we were a danger within ourselves, albeit relatively safe from outer forces. But we were with each other despite the hard circumstances, and even though things weren't getting better, and they probably would get worse, we stood in a place we chose to be, together. Aww. I know I've mentioned this a million times, but it really was a strange place. Looking back, I wonder how half of us even survived when we were already in a fragile state of mind. It was never a supportive place either. I wouldn't call it unsupportive, though. I hope I haven't made it come off like an either-or situation. Yes, Kinstagrammers were generally accepting of marginalized identities, and yes, you could just find people who would uplift and loved you, but the amount of times people got exposed for being racist or just generally weird was insane. For example, due to the popularity of Japanese media, a lot of people were revealed to be fetishizers of Japanese culture or just tended to infantilize Asians and neglect them when they had valid complaints about the way Kinstagram had treated them. According to one anon, Kinsta was unrelenting to East/Southeast Asians who felt discomfort of a non-East Asian, typically white but not always, who would claim to be the IRL of an SEA character whose Asianness was an important part of their character, or if they were going by like a Japanese name. If they weren't Japanese, for example. This hostility to East Asians and communities surrounding primarily media by East Asians, anime, rhythm games, gacha games, K-pop, etc. was very sinister and made a lot of us feel isolated and uncomfortable in our own fandom spaces. Yikes. Hate speech was pretty rampant, or at least to an extent that it had a pretty big effect on general morale. You'd hear a lot of slurs directed at others negatively, but also positively, like in an endearing way. That, which is obviously not hate speech, just mostly just queer chronically online people being queer chronically online people. Anyways, I'd say the most supportive Kinsta ever was when people were voicing their harmful anti-recovery thoughts. Again, oxymoron. Supportive in the least helpful ways, helpful in the least supportive ways. Now, with all these deeply entangled and intertwined toxic, don't get me wrong though, they could be very helpful or eventually develop to be so, relationships, it was no wonder that we began to influence each other, often even developing similar personalities. An Anon survey response called it the Kinsta personality, mentioning it as such: annoying, says slurs every 2 words, post score, etc. While I definitely can't say these were unanimous traits, there were definitely some similarities, if not as extreme, to what my anonymous server responder has said. I don't mean anything negative by saying this, because I was a part of it too, but a lot of Kinstagrammers tended to be pretty edgy and have similar senses of humor, which sometimes did include saying a lot of slurs or posting gore. I guess that's what happens when you're addictively in the same community. For example, a lot of the most popular posts that still linger around today center around killing yourself, swearing, or just general toxicness to the point that it becomes completely absurd. Not only were there similar personalities within Kinsta, but there was a lot of demonization of personality disorders, most often cluster B ones such as BPD or bipolar. A lot of my survey takers noticed how it seemed like a lot of people were faking or exaggerating, and while I'm not one to support fake claiming, it felt like much of Kinstagram was just misguided, misunderstood teenagers who didn't quite understand the full context of the words they used and just spent too much time on the internet. Hell, I was one of them. It was the blind leading the blind. Even the shepherds, popular Kinstagrammers didn't know enough to lead the rest of us, properly. In some cases, they knew the least, capitalizing on their unstable conditions to gain traction. Honestly, the less stable and more edgy you were, the more chances you'd go viral. Instagram put a lot of value in shock factor and first impressions, with it almost becoming a competition to see who could be edgier sometimes. Now, the last thing I want to touch on before I wrap up my thoughts completely is just how little information there is on Instagram online. There are 3 or 4 definitions of it on Urban Dictionary, the most liked definition literally just being, please run while you still can, it's not worth it, touch grass. You'll also occasionally see micro-niche celebrity social media accounts mention it in passing, often giving themselves or others the title of Kinstagram veteran. Still, search Kinstagram up on Google and you get nothing. TikTok and you get barely anything. More fandom-oriented platforms such as Tumblr or Twitter have a fair chunk of portion related to Kinsta. And well, Instagram obviously has a lot too. But it is not something you will find unless you actively seek it out, or at least not anymore. Kinstagram stays within its own corners, no longer a focus or anything attracting mentally ill teens like a moth to a flame. Instead, it is composed of people who have been there for a pretty long time and have just hung around. Remember that the majority of my survey takers have been on Kinsta for over 3 years. I'm honestly very glad it has grown calmer and tamer. I'd say it was during early 2022 that a large majority of Kinstagrammers began to wake up from their kidding fervor and by now have almost completely drifted away from it. Things changed very quickly, very rapidly. Really, I just think it was because a lot of us began to grow up, mature, and develop more concrete selves and identities that no longer were completely reliant on fictional characters. This, I believe, is when Kinstagram started becoming less of a hideaway and more of just a chill place to find friends. Because unless you stumble upon a niche of the niche, Kinstagram is much less intense nowadays. People are still very much on Kinstagram, don't get me wrong. In fact, 51% of the people who took my survey say they're still on it. Still, it's much, much more chill. Now, so began the era of irony posting, which we are still very much a part of it today. When people posted unironically in 2020, we post ironically now. Irony posting is pretty big in non-Kinstagram circles as well, so if you're watching this, you've probably seen at least a little bit of it here and there on the internet. I'm not going to lie, it gets a bit too much sometimes. There is an interesting component of self-awareness and acknowledgement within irony posting itself, but that is for another day and a very different video essay. Because this one is about to end. Honestly, despite putting an end to the video essay, I still have a lot to say. But those thoughts are less critical and much more personal, and I'd rather not get them out to the general public. There is just so much untapped potential material within Kinstagram that I could not possibly cover in just such a shortish video essay. But with that said, I hope everything was still comprehensible and my thoughts weren't too messy or all over the place. Seriously, I may have yapped or written up the script a bit too much sometimes. Now, as always, thank you so much for watching. A repeat thank you to everyone who participated in the video essay as survey respondents. Seriously, whether your responses got into the video or not, I appreciated them greatly. Don't think I could have done half of this writing without all the amazing, incredibly detailed insight I got. Another shout out to all my friends, mutuals, and followers who encouraged me to pursue and continue this project. Love you all very much. And as any YouTuber has to say, if you enjoyed this video, feel free to subscribe and follow my socials, Chef Dalu, and or Fairly Silly on Instagram, and Chef Dalu on Twitter. Comment your own thoughts and perspective as well. Doesn't matter if you're an outsider observing the whole situation, or part of Kinstagram, or have never heard of it at all. I'd still love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much one last time.